My sons, the galaxy is burning. We all bear witness to a final truth. Our way is not the way of the Imperium. You have never stood in the Emperor's light, never worn the Imperial eagle, and you never will. You shall stand in midnight clad, your claws forever red with the lifeblood of my father's failed empire, warring through the centuries as the talons of a murdered god. Rise, my sons, and take your wrath across the stars in my name, in my memory. Rise, my Night Lords. Primarch Conrad Kurz at the final gathering of the 8th Legion. The Night Lords, once known as the 8th Legion of Space Marines during the first founding, betrayed the Emperor's trust during the tumultuous Horus heresy of the 31st millennium. Their defection marked them as one of the 9 infamous traitor legions of Chaos Space Marines. Unlike other Chaos factions, the Night Lords do not pledge allegiance to any one of the 4 major Chaos gods. Instead, they acknowledge the chaotic pantheon as a whole, operating under the banner of Chaos Undivided. Their singular goal is to spread terror and fear across the galaxy, and they are unmatched in their expertise at using these tactics to demoralize their enemies long before the first blow is struck. Renowned for their ruthless, uncompromising warfare, the Night Lords wield terror and slaughter as weapons, applying overwhelming force without mercy or hesitation. They forsake subtlety and strategy, preferring instead to annihilate their foes in brutal displays of unrestrained carnage. Though their methods may seem wanton and mindless now, there was once a darker logic behind their brutality. 10 millennia ago, the Legion's Primarch, Conrad Kurz, was consumed by a desire to impose justice upon the corrupt and lawless. Born into the oppressive world of Nostramo, Kurz's violent tendencies stemmed from a warped sense of justice. In his early years, this drive to punish the wicked and enforce order dominated his actions. However, as the Chaos Gods eventually claimed his soul, Kurz's relentless pursuit of justice was twisted into something far darker, shaping the brutal methods his gene sons now employ. Unlike most Primarchs who were raised by the people among whom they landed after being scattered across the stars by the ruinous powers, Conrad Kurz matured in the bleakest of environments. Nostramo was a dark industrial wasteland, its cities consumed by anarchy and crime, with the planet's only valuable resource being the raw adamantium mined from its depths. In this grim setting, Kurz grew up as a feral child, scavenging among the filth of the hive cities where he fought for survival alongside the vermin that infested the sewers. As with all the Emperor's sons, Kurz grew rapidly, his intellect and physical prowess developing at an alarming rate. He witnessed firsthand the worst excesses of Nostramo's society. Murder, corruption and fear ruled the night. In response, Kurz took it upon himself to become a predator of the wicked, hunting down criminals and leaving their mutilated corpses displayed as grim warnings. The people soon whispered of the Night Haunter, the terror that stalked the streets, a figure whose judgment was absolute and unforgiving. So feared was Kurz's wrath that even the innocent hid within their homes, and a fragile peace was enforced on the dark planet. By the time the Emperor arrived on Nostramo, Kurz had already established himself as the dominant force on his world. His reign as Nostramo's Dark King was one not of mercy, but of fear and oppression. Crime ceased, not because of new laws or enlightenment, but because the population understood that even the smallest transgression would result in death at the hands of their dark ruler. When the Emperor finally revealed himself to Kurz, many hoped this would signal a new era for Nostramo. Yet, once Kurz left to join the Emperor's Great Crusade, Nostramo quickly fell back into the lawless chaos from which it had briefly emerged. Though Kurz's methods were brutal, they stemmed from his distorted sense of justice. Growing up in such a savage environment, he came to believe that only through absolute domination could order be maintained, and that any sign of weakness would be exploited. Even as Kurz fought alongside his fellow Primarchs during the Great Crusade, he held firm to this grim outlook, rejecting hope and optimism as naive illusions in favor of his belief in the harshness of the natural order. Isolated and brooding, Kurz distanced himself from his brothers, preferring the company of his legion, the Night Lords, whom he moulded in his own image. He taught them his methods of terror-based warfare and instilled within them his philosophy of control through fear. Even before the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords had gained a reputation for employing tactics that others considered excessively brutal and inhumane. They ruthlessly crushed those who resisted the Great Crusade, annihilating opposition with such force and savagery that few dared to defy them. Through sheer terror, they subjugated entire worlds, ensuring that the mere whisper of their arrival could send populations into panic long before the first blade was drawn. Like many of the Primarchs who turned against the Emperor and the ideals they were created to uphold, Konrad Curze reached a point of no return long before his ultimate betrayal. In the years leading up to the Horus Heresy, Curze physically clashed with Rogel Dawn, an act that led his brothers to convene a council to address his growing instability. Rather than face their judgment, Curze slaughtered his guards on the world of Shero, fleeing his pursuers and returning to the world of Nostramo. There, in the year 984 of the 30th millennium, Curze exacted his final vengeance upon the society that had regressed into the very corruption and criminality he had once fought so hard to purge. The Night Lord's fleet struck a vulnerable point in Nostramo's crust and unleashed their full arsenal, reducing the planet to ruin and, some say, condemning Konrad Curze to eternal damnation. When Warmaster Horus revealed his treachery and ignited the galaxy in civil war, Curze embraced the cause of the traitors, indulging in a bitter campaign of unrestrained death and destruction. His most violent impulses were given free rein, and he taught his legion to make examples of their enemies, not merely to defeat them. The Night Lords razed cities, slaughtered entire populations and displayed their mutilated corpses as grim warnings to those who might resist. This bloody rampage continued unabated even after Horus's defeat at the Siege of Terra. Curze, however, never fully embraced chaos during the Horus Heresy. Unlike many of his traitorous brothers, he didn't ascend to demonhood nor seek the blessings of the ruinous powers. His end came at the hand of a Kaleidus assassin sent to kill him. Throughout his life, Curze was plagued by prophetic visions of dark and catastrophic futures. His final vision foretold that his death would come at the hands of such an assassin, a glimpse of fate he inherited from the Emperor's own precognitive powers. Unlike his brothers, Curze did not resist this fate. Alone among the Primarchs, he welcomed his death. When the Kaleidus assassin Moshen arrived to take his life, Curze offered no resistance, allowing her to end his tormented existence. In death, Curze achieved the one thing he had always desired: vindication. His acceptance of his fate affirmed his nihilistic worldview, that the Imperium of man was hypocritical, its idealistic goals achieved through immoral means. In dying, Curze believed he had triumphed, exposing the Emperor's empire as the corrupt entity he had always claimed it to be. This belief endures in the gene sons he left behind. The Night Lords, inspired by their Primarch's vision, continue their eternal campaign of bloodshed and terror in the long war against the hated Imperium of the so-called Corpse Emperor. It is neither the great deeds we perform in battle, nor the wise words we utter in peace that shape us, but rather the hidden things we choose to undertake in the dark while none can see that define us. Atra. Konrad Curze, carved into the walls of his prison on Shero. Since the grim days of the Horus Heresy, Imperial scholars have long debated how the unshakable loyalty of so many Legiones Astartes could have turned to treachery, their steadfast devotion twisted into hatred, and their noble ideals corrupted into malice. Yet, when it comes to the Night Lords, one might wonder if their hearts had always belonged to the shadows. Created for a higher calling, their fate could have been different, but their legacy is steeped in poisoned ideology and atrocity. Even during the time when they stood among the loyal Space Marine legions, the nature of the Night Lords and their actions raised uncomfortable questions. Some believed that they were simply a necessary evil, the monsters needed to drag a brutal galaxy into the light. Others whispered that they were a rare mistake, a miscalculation on the part of the Emperor, made worse by circumstances beyond his control. There are those who wonder if they were damned from the very moment of their creation, destined never to share in the future they were helping to build. But such speculation is futile, for regardless of the cause, the Night Lords have always been creatures of horror. From their inception, the 8th Legion was steeped in blood. The Legion's earliest recruits were drawn from the infamous prison sinks of ancient terror. In vast, crumbling caverns beneath the hive cities, men and women who had defied the laws of their masters were condemned to live out their days in perpetual darkness. Never again would they see sunlight or breathe the free air of the surface. Their existence was one of fear, where survival balanced on the edge of a blade. These lightless caverns were places of lawlessness, where only the most savage and ruthless could endure. Fed by a constant influx of new prisoners from the cities above, these underworld warrens were gates to madness and murder. Amidst the endless bloodshed and despair, children were born into the darkness. Raised in an environment of death and cruelty, those who survived past a solar decade became pale, silent shadows, their movements ghostly and soundless. They were known as the Night's Children, and even the most brutal killers avoided them when possible. It was from these eerie children of the darkness that the Emperor of Mankind forged the first warriors of the 8th Legion. With skins so pale it resembled ash or powdered bone, these recruits were far removed in appearance and demeanour from their fellow legionaries. The gene seed of their future Primarch, Conrad Kurz, seemed unnaturally suited to the human stock of these first Terran recruits. It was as though the gene seed had been crafted with these pale children in mind. Beyond enhancing their ghostly complexion, the gene seed endowed the Night Lords with an extraordinary ability to see through darkness, far surpassing the nocturnal vision of their brother Astartes. Yet this gift was also a curse, for it forced them to perceive the light of suns and stars only through filters and buffers. Even though they now walked in the light of the surface world, the warriors of the 8th Legion were forever bound to the eternal night from which they had come. The first task the Emperor assigned to his 8th Legion was to enforce his will upon those who clung to the remnants of humanity's dark past, those who believed the sins of old night could persist in the newly forged Imperium of Man. Many who had bent the knee to the Emperor did so reluctantly, convinced they had no other choice. Others, who had witnessed the rise and fall of countless techno-barbarian empires during the Age of Strife, dismissed the Emperor's rule as yet another transient dominion. The crimes committed against the nascent Imperium took many forms. The Saragorn Enclave continued their vile genetic experiments in secret, the court of Antaeus engaged in unsanctioned psychobreeding, and the infamous March of 10 Million exemplified a refusal to abandon the forbidden ways of old night. In cases where mere destruction would not suffice, where retribution was necessary to make an example, the Emperor unleashed the 8th Legion. Such grim duties aligned well with the early nature of the 8th Legion. Whether due to their gene seed, their origins in the forsaken prison sinks of terror, or the harsh indoctrination of the Imperium, these warriors were driven by an unyielding sense of moral absolutism and a fervent thirst for retribution. In the universe of the 8th Legion, there existed no shades of grey, no varying degrees of guilt or innocence. For them, truth and falsehood were as distinct as light and darkness, indivisible and absolute. Darkness represented guilt, deceit and monstrosity, and those who dwelt in it could only be taught the language of blood, punished swiftly and mercilessly. Justice, to them, was the light that cut through the shadow, cold, indifferent, and as unforgiving as the edge of a blade. The warriors of the 8th Legion were beings of the dark, fighting for a future filled with light, a future that would have no place for their kind. At least, this is what later historians claimed. Perhaps such memories were too kind. Perhaps many sought to attribute nobility to monsters, fabricating a higher purpose behind the atrocities they committed. Without such justifications, how could one tolerate their continued existence? It would be easy to say that the arrival of Conrad Kurz changed everything, that the 8th Legion's descent into darkness began when their gene sire was reunited with them. But the truth is, it was the cursed world of Nostramo that set both Kurz and his legion on the path to betrayal. Kurz was the gene father of the 8th Legion, but his soul was shaped by two fathers, the Emperor who crafted him from divine essence, and Nostramo, the planet that raised and twisted him. While the Emperor's original intentions for his gene sons remain unknown, the nature of Nostramo is well documented. Nostramo was a world of despair, a sunless hive world of suffering, corruption, and endless darkness. At the heart of a string of planets in the Nostramo sector, it was one of the few worlds that had maintained the ability to traverse the stars throughout the Age of Strife. The planet was home to sprawling hive cities, choked with industry and the sweat of millions. Nostramo's wealth lay buried deep within its crust, where seams of valuable adamantine ore fed distant worlds and fueled the Imperium's war machine. Shrouded in perpetual darkness, Nostramo's surface was barely illuminated, its atmosphere so thick with pollution that the feeble light of its dying star could not penetrate the toxic haze. At noon, the planet was only marginally brighter than at midnight, cloaked in murky greys and impenetrable blacks. Only the wealthy could afford the luxury of artificial illumination, dim blue glow strips that adorned the ceilings of their opulent dwellings in the upper spires of the hive cities. Nostramo was dominated by 5 major hive cities that dotted the planet's habitable region, named Nostramo Prime through Nostramo Quintus. These cities operated as vast, self-sustaining industrial complexes. Due to Nostramo's synchronicity with its moon Tenebor, which blocked what little light its star provided, the planet experienced an eternal night, even during its brief summer. The hive cities themselves were grim, foreboding places, mazes of stone and iron. Kilometre-high smokestacks spewed their noxious fumes into the eternal gloom, while bridges of blackened metal crisscrossed the narrow streets and alleys far below. Towers of wealth and power, grand mansions, cathedrals and factories rose from the teeming slums, their facades crawling with grotesque gargoyles, silent watchers over a world where darkness reigned, and light was a rare, precious commodity. A thick, choking smog clung to every surface of Nostramo, much like a shroud draped over a dying man. The faint glimmer of light from windows and dim lamps barely pierced the gloom, creating sickly halos that seemed to hang in the air. The atmosphere was heavy with dust, acrid smoke, and the stench of toxic chemicals which slowly seeped into the very flesh of the planet's inhabitants. The people's lives were whittled away, each breath shortening their years, condemning them to a slow and grinding decline devoid of hope or the warmth of happiness. Physiologically, the people of Nostramo shared much with baseline humans from the Segmentum Solar, though they bore one stark difference. They had no irises. Their eyes were black, empty voids reflecting only their pupils. They were pale, thin and gaunt, figures moulded by distrust, dark humour and a hardened callousness. This form of albinism, though rare in other parts of humanity, had become a near-universal trait among the Nostraman populace. The overwhelming majority of the planet's inhabitants lived in abject poverty, working long hours as labourers in the foundries. Meanwhile, the rich few grew even wealthier, trampling or outright killing anyone who dared challenge their position. Clinical depression and mental illness were inescapable facets of life, and overpopulation was curbed not by disease or war, but by the sheer prevalence of suicide. For most, life ended coughing up blood and blackened dust on a filthy pallet, as chemicals ate away at their bones from within. Yet even such slow deaths were merciful compared to the other horrors that could befall a Nostraman. Nostramo belonged to the darkness in every sense. Its very existence was a living nightmare, rivaling the worst Xenos enslavement or the darkest tales from the age of technology. True laws, if they had ever existed, had long been consumed by the greed of the powerful and the desperation of the masses. Murder had become the only currency of survival, and violence was the measure of strength. Every imaginable sin found its home in the planet's unending night. Those who chronicled its dark history after the planet's reclamation spoke of constant weeping and pleading on the wind, of children growing up knowing that only the law of the knife governed life, and that the strong alone held the right to impose their will on others. Across the planet, from the lofty heights of the nobility to the lowest slum alleys, criminal gangs reigned supreme. These gangs, named or otherwise, ruled every corner of Nostramo. In the slum-ridden habitation stacks, they ruled through terror, killing, torturing and waging brutal wars against the feral outcasts who roamed like wild animals. Many gangs even feasted on the dead, treating their territories like the hunting grounds of predators. In the mines and factories, where industry still groaned on beneath the weight of corruption, gangs bore names that mimicked authority. The Iron Overseers, the Hands of Corregado, and the Sons of Toil. These brutes, thick with muscle and scarred by the furnaces, paraded through the streets, clanking with weaponry and stinking of bloodshed, enforcing a twisted form of slavery. In the wealthier districts, the spoiled offspring of the ruling elite strutted in ostentatious costumes, preening like peacocks, quick to settle scores with a blade or pistol over the slightest insult. Despite the differences in appearance and behavior, almost all of Nostramo's gangs owed allegiance to one of the countless barons, counts and lords who ruled the planet. These figures in turn answered to even more powerful masters, many of whom cloaked themselves in courtly titles that echoed the nobility of ages long past. Yet beneath these trappings of feudal power and birthright, there was no true distinction between the aristocracy and the criminal overlords. They were one and the same. Together they reigned as the cruel monarchs of a kingdom steeped in sin. It is better by far to be an object of fear than of respect, for one is a truth of the soul and the other an illusion of the mind. The Codex, Hydra. According to the heretical handwritten account known simply as the Dark, the Primarch Conrad. Curz's earliest memory was his descent to the night-cloaked planet of Nostramo. He arrived as a crackling sphere of light, his gestation capsule ripped from distant terror by the warp's dark currents and the vile machinations of the Chaos Gods, hurtling down to Nostramo's largest hive city, Nostramo Quintus. The capsule crashed through the dense, decaying layers of the cityscape, burrowing deep into the planet's crust and geosphere, finally coming to rest near its molten, volatile core. The impact of Curz's arrival left a permanent scar upon the otherwise impervious adamantium strata of Nostramo, an indelible mark of his violent birth into a world devoid of light. This gaping crater was later sealed and regarded with superstitious fear. Some speculated that Curz had swum through molten metal or that volcanic forces had borne him to the surface, so bizarre was his emergence. Unlike the other Primarchs, Curz was not taken in by any human family. He fended for himself, alone and unaided, in the grim underbelly of Nostramo Quintus. He survived through sheer determination, honing his instincts by hunting the feral beasts that stalked the vast hive. Throughout his early life, Curz was plagued by precognitive visions, haunting, waking nightmares of the darkest possible futures that would torment him all his days. Unique among his brothers, Curz grew up entirely alone, bereft of human contact, relying only on his ruthlessness, intellect and fierce will to survive in the underhives. With his genetically augmented abilities, both physical and mental, he swiftly rose to dominance within the city, unleashing such horrifying atrocities upon the criminal gangs and corrupt nobility that he imposed a twisted order on Nostramo Quintus. In time, the same ruthless discipline extended to the other 4 hive cities. Within a standard year of Curz's arrival, Nostramo's crime rate had plummeted to nothing. The planet's society was utterly transformed, and the effects rippled across the world. Nostramo Quintus adopted a self-imposed curfew. Its streets, once buzzing with activity even at midnight, now fell silent by dusk. Mothers whispered of the dreaded Night Haunter to frighten unruly children into obedience. The legend of the Night Haunter spread quickly. Rumours of a monstrous, shadowy figure stalking the alleys and tunnels, its claws ready to disembowel the unwary, took hold of the city. Fear gripped Nostramo Quintus, and its people lived in terror, speaking in hushed tones, lest their words bring the Haunter's judgment upon them. Through sheer brutality, Curz became the acknowledged ruler of his hive city, and eventually of the entire planet. His reign earned him the title Night Haunter, a name associated with the brutal murders of hundreds, if not thousands, of criminals and aristocrats. After his fall to chaos during the Horus Heresy, Kurz would embrace the name once more, wearing it like a badge of infamy. As the first monarch or Dark King of Nostramo Quintus, Night Haunter absorbed knowledge with a voracious hunger. His rule was characterized by temperance and reason until word of some injustice reached his ears. Then, with unparalleled savagery, he would hunt down the offender, pursuing them through the empty streets until their collapse from exhaustion. Only then would he descend upon his prey, mutilating them beyond recognition as punishment. This volatile pattern of benevolent rule, punctuated by acts of extreme vengeance, ushered the planet into an age of unprecedented prosperity and honesty. Adamantium exports tripled as Nostramo's society reaped the rewards of shared wealth, tempered by a shared fear of their merciless ruler. The capital, Nostramo Quintus, grew prosperous and well-lit under his shadow, and as it flourished, so did the other cities, eager to avoid attracting the Night Haunter's lethal attentions. Kurz, almost single-handedly, rid Nostramo of its pervasive culture of crime and corruption, wielding terror as a weapon to destroy the planet's criminal syndicates and their overseers. Under his tyrannical rule, law was re-established, and the people came to revere him as a just, if terrifying, dictator. His natural instincts as a hunter, mastery of stealth, and affinity for psychological warfare, all traits he passed to the 8th Space Marine Legion, became his tools. Even before the Horus Heresy, the Night Lords decorated their power armor with symbols of death, recognizing that fear was just as powerful a weapon as a bolter or chainsword. Nearly a century into the Great Crusade, in the year 896 of the 30th millennium, the Emperor of Mankind and his vast fleet arrived at the shadowed world of Nostramo, an event long foretold in the planet's cryptic prophecies, an omen of Nostramo's ultimate ruin. The Emperor's arrival brought light to the world for the first time, a blinding radiance piercing the eternal night. Descending upon Nostramo Quintus, the Emperor led his delegation through the heart of the city on foot. The people, long accustomed to the oppressive darkness, recoiled from the brightness. His luminous presence, reflecting off the rain-drenched streets, caused many to weep in awe, while those bold enough to gaze directly at him were seared by his brilliance, their sight forever lost. At the end of the great boulevard leading to the Night Haunter's palace, Conrad Kurz awaited the Emperor's approach. As the delegation drew near, Kurz was overwhelmed by a psychic vision of such immense horror that in a moment of madness he tried to tear out his own eyes. Before he could succeed, the Emperor stayed his hand. Night Haunter gazed upon the Emperor, and the Master of Mankind spoke. "Be at peace, Conrad Kurz. I have come to bring you home." Kurz, his voice cold and resolute, replied, "That is not my name, Father. My people have named me, and I shall bear that name until the hour of my death. I know well what fate you have in store for me." With grim acceptance, Kurz bowed to the Emperor's will, as if he were fulfilling a destiny he had long dreaded. From that moment, the fate of the 8th Legion was sealed, setting them on their inevitable descent into darkness and damnation. "We have received your offer of surrender and reject it. We did not come to receive your supplication, but to enact judgment. The time to surrender has long passed. The verdict is writ by your own hands. Now is the time to die." Night Lord's multi-channel Vox broadcast, The Pacification of Lystrantia. Night Haunter swiftly absorbed the doctrines of the Imperium, mastering the complex teachings of the Legiones Astartes under the guidance of Primarch Fulgrim. Soon after, he was acknowledged as the leader of the 8th Space Marine Legion, whom he named the Night Lords. Though his legion displayed excellence on countless battlefields, an unsettling pattern emerged. The Night Lords knew no method of warfare, but the total, brutal, and merciless application of force to achieve their ends. Over the first few years of his leadership, Night Haunter shaped his warriors into an implacable force, driven by a fanatical pursuit of justice that mirrored the zeal of the most unrelenting witch hunters. Night Haunter encouraged his legion to adorn their power armor with fearsome imagery designed to paralyze the enemy with terror, a tactic that proved devastatingly effective. The mere rumor of the Night Lord's presence would compel entire rebellious star systems to pay overdue imperial tithes, cease illegal activities, and purge their populations of mutants and suspected traitors. The reunion of Night Haunter and his legion marked the beginning of a descent into ever greater darkness. After his departure, Nostromo fell back into lawlessness, and instead of offering up its finest youth to the Night Lords, the planet began to provide the Legion with the cruel and the broken, drenched in violence and bloodshed. This poisoned the Legion from within, some argue, transforming many of the Night Lords into mere murderers granted the genetic strength of demigods. Yet to suggest this corruption stemmed solely from Nostromo's influence is to ignore the role of Kurz himself. Though he came to despise his gene sons, he remained their lord and pushed them further into atrocity. The Night Lord's methods, once perhaps justifiable, became acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake, evidence of their transformation from necessary monsters to simple beasts reveling in carnage. As the Great Crusade pressed forward, the Night Lords were deployed by the Emperor as instruments of terror, sent to subdue planets recently conquered by other Space Marine legions. Their terrifying reputation was such that rebellious planetary governors or insurgents would surrender, often in fear of the retribution the Night Lords would deliver, retribution that might result in an exterminatus over the most trivial infraction. It is evident the Emperor harboured concerns regarding the growing instability of both Kurz and his legion. Yet, for reasons unknown, there was little action taken to temper the excesses of the Eighth Legion. Perhaps there were threats or demands, but no judgment fell upon them, and so the Night Lords were left to continue their atrocities unabated. The tally of their crimes grew ever longer in the decades before Kurz's final betrayal. Like a spiral descending into shadow, the Night Lord's path led only to darkness. Of all the Emperor's legions, the Eighth was perhaps the most suspect, and it is unsurprising they were censured for their massacres even before the outbreak of the Horus heresy. They were born of the night, serving a father, consumed by foreboding and righteousness, and their fate was to fall back into the shadows that had shaped them. The destruction of Nostromo in the year 984 of the 30th millennium was the ultimate step in this decline, marking the point at which the Night Lords abandoned the last remnants of honour. Though the Dropsite massacre is often seen as the first instance of a Primarch turning upon another, there was one confrontation that predates even this infamous betrayal. The event is little known, concealed deep within the archives of the Imperial Palace, but it reveals much about Kurz's growing instability. This incident took place after the brutal Shiro compliance campaign, where the Emperor's children, Imperial Fists and Night Lords were deployed to bring a particularly stubborn human enclave into the Imperium's fold. All three legions' Primarchs were present, a rare occurrence, but there was little common ground between Rogel Dawn and Kurz. By the end of the campaign, Kurz's indiscriminate slaughter had driven a wedge of bitter resentment between him and Dawn. The savagery of the Night Lords had long drawn scorn from their brother legions, and as the disdain deepened, Kurz's prophetic visions of betrayal and ruin intensified. He foresaw the collapse of everything he had fought for, his gene sons descending into mindless monstrosity, the galaxy's fragile order crumbling into chaos. His withdrawal from reality deepened, and the once glimmering hope within him extinguished, leaving only despair and a constant haunting by a doomed future. Upon learning that Nostromo had slipped back into anarchy, Kurz, at the end of the Shiro campaign, sought solace among his brother Primarchs. Yet his isolation, long-standing and profound, left him without allies. The other Primarchs could offer little comfort, their reactions cool and dismissive. Haunted by visions of his own death and of his legion warring endlessly with their fellow Astartes, Kurz fell deeper into depression. Despite the presence of his comrades, he remained aloof, plagued by prophetic nightmares and offering only cryptic hints about the source of his torment. This growing sense of isolation soon blossomed into paranoia, deepening the rift between Night Haunter and his brother Primarchs. The tension escalated dramatically after the pacification of the Shirot system. Following this campaign, Kurz shared his troubling visions with his mentor, Fulgrim. Shocked by the dark premonitions, Fulgrim confided in Rogel Dawn, who was already seething over the Night Lord's brutal tactics during the Shiro conflict. Dawn, offended by what he perceived as Kurz's defamation of the Emperor's honour, confronted him. The exact details of their encounter remain obscured, but Dawn was found grievously wounded, and Kurz's personal guard lay slaughtered. Those present were sworn to silence, and Night Haunter was placed under guard, awaiting judgment by his brothers. However, there would be no trial or penance for Kurz. He escaped his confinement, leaving a trail of dead in his wake, further deepening the schism between the legions. Blood had been shed among the Primarchs, a crack in their once unbreakable brotherhood. Upon his escape, Kurz returned to Nostromo with his legion and fulfilled one of his prophetic visions. In an act of both vengeance and final judgment, the Night Lords unleashed their full fury upon their homeworld, obliterating it. Imperial pursuit ships arrived just in time to witness the Night Lord's lance batteries fire into the gaping wound in the planet's surface left by Kurz's arrival decades earlier. The planet's core destabilized, tearing Nostromo apart. Though, as a Primarch, Kurz held the right to destroy or liberate worlds as he saw fit, the annihilation of Nostromo marked the Night Lord's final severance from any semblance of restraint. It was a symbolic act of defiance, as much as it was one of finality. Accounts of Kurz's subsequent actions vary. One version holds that after Nostromo's destruction, Kurz and his legion were summoned to Terra to explain themselves. There, they were reprimanded by the Emperor and the Council of Terra, their use of an exterminatus on their homeworld seen as the last straw. Kurz defended his actions, claiming that Nostromo had reverted to its former state of corruption and crime in the Legion's absence. Both he and the Night Lords were embittered, feeling that their actions were merely the continuation of the role they had always been assigned, using fear and brutality to enforce imperial rule. To Kurz, the Emperor's censure was hypocrisy, for the Great Crusade itself was a violent conquest to forcibly unite the disparate worlds of humanity. In his eyes, the Emperor condemned him for doing what had once been essential to the Imperium's creation. Another version suggests that after Nostromo's destruction, Kurz and the Night Lords vanished into the uncharted regions of the Great Crusade, choosing not to return to Terra to face judgment. In this account, no word of Kurz's quiet rebellion reached the wider Imperium. No formal condemnation was issued, and no punitive fleets were sent to bring the errant Primarch to heel. The Night Lords continued to operate within other expeditionary fleets, facing no immediate repercussions, while Kurz himself remained in the shadows, waging his brutal campaigns on the fringes of known space, still proclaiming his loyalty to the Emperor. In truth, many within the Imperium's higher echelons valued the unity of the Emperor's crusade more than they did the open punishment of a rogue warlord. Some may have even feared the consequences of pushing Kurz too far. Instead, they enacted subtler measures, cutting off supplies to sectors controlled by the Night Lords and gradually isolating Kurz from the Crusade's vanguard. By the early 31st millennium, the Court of Terror deemed this silent punishment sufficient and issued an order for Kurz's recall, offering him a place in the Loyalist fleet assembling to confront Horus Lupercal's betrayal at Istvan. Hatred is never so sweet, and vengeance never so pleasurable, than when it is applied to one once loved. Nostroman Proverb. Throughout history, Conrad Kurz, the Night Haunter, has often been regarded as the clearest embodiment of evil among the traitor Primarchs. His bloodthirsty tendencies and affinity for torture were well known among his siblings long before the Horus heresy began. His most infamous acts, the brutal obliteration of his homeworld Nostromo and his assault on Rogel Dawn, remained largely hidden during the final years of the Great Crusade. Yet these are but fragments of the tragic narrative of Kurz, whose greatest curse was to have inherited too much of his father's vision. Like several of his brothers, Kurz possessed a fragment of the Emperor's precognitive powers, a flawed sliver of his foresight. Whereas the Emperor could see all possible futures and steer a course through them, Kurz was cursed to perceive only a single strand, a bleak vision of doom, defeat and death. No matter how much he achieved, no matter the heights to which he rose from the horror of his youth on Nostromo's corrupt streets, the future remained constant in its grim inevitability. This unrelenting vision gnawed at his sanity, eroding his purpose and plunging him into despair. By the time the Great Crusade neared its end, Kurz stood perilously close to the abyss of madness. What truly drove him to ally with Horus in rebellion is unknown. Was it a desperate attempt to alter the fate he had foreseen? Or was it a need to drown his dark visions in blood and destruction? Regardless, by the time of the Thramas Crusade, Kurz was but a shadow of the brilliant warrior and general he had once been. The purpose he had wrested from the ruins of Nostramo had been devoured by anger and hopelessness, leaving a void within his soul. As Kurz drifted deeper into the abyss, his sons, the Night Lords, were left to find their own path. Some clung to the fading memory of their days during the Great Crusade, when they were a brotherhood seeking to forge a better future. Others sought only the solace of death and destruction, reveling in slaughter for its own sake. With their Primarch lost to his obsessions and nightmares, it was the Gene sons of Kurz who would decide the fate of the Legion. Some hoped to restore him to his former dark grandeur, while others sought to drive him deeper into madness. The Thramas Crusade, fought in the remote worlds of the Eastern Fringe during the Horus Heresy, became a battlefield not only for the fate of the Legion, but also for the soul of their Primarch. By the end of the Great Crusade, the Night Lords were already set upon a path of ruin, a path that had begun long ago on Terra, woven by the enigmatic plans of the Emperor himself. The end of that journey was written in the stars, but the Night Lords would not go quietly. They would not meekly accept their doom. Instead, they would resist it with violence and bloodshed. Amidst the horrors of the Horus Heresy, the first signs of their grim fate began to surface. Under the leadership of Kurz, the Legion would turn on itself in a desperate bid to break free from the curse of its Primarch. But the true blight that afflicted the Night Lords was not an external force. It was rooted deep within the Legion itself, planted by the Emperor's own hand. The curse that had haunted the Night Haunter from the beginning lay at the heart of the Legion's soul, a festering wound that no amount of bloodshed could heal. Afflicted with a fragment of his father's precognitive vision, Kurz foresaw the dark destiny awaiting him and his Legion beyond the Horus Heresy. He had once struggled against that fate, believing that the blood he spilled and the lives he claimed might be enough to shift the course of the future. But even after Horus shattered the Emperor's grand designs, Kurz's vision remained unaltered, a constant reminder that all his efforts had been in vain. By the time of the Thramas Crusade, Kurz had fully embraced his doom. He revelled in the futility of his existence, convinced that his role in the Emperor's grand plan was to be a villain, a necessary evil. The rejection of their methods by the Emperor left both Kurz and his Legion embittered. They willingly joined Horus's rebellion, not out of loyalty to chaos, but out of a sense of defiance against the Emperor's perceived hypocrisy. When the War Master unleashed his treachery during the Istvan III atrocity, Kurz committed fully to the campaign of death and terror that would define his legacy. For years, the Night Lords had existed in the shadowy fringes of the Great Crusade, using fear and brutality to enforce imperial compliance. Now, untethered from any moral restraint, they unleashed a campaign of terror and slaughter that would echo across the stars for millennia to come. Even when the Emperor's forces assembled to strike against Horus, many were surprised to see the Night Lords among them. For years, the 8th Legion had skirted the line between sanction and censure, acting as enforcers of terror. As the Drop Site Massacre would later reveal, the Night Lords had not truly forsaken their ties to the Imperium. They had become the very monsters they once claimed to hunt. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, as the galaxy descended into chaos, the Night Lords embarked on a campaign of horror that stretched into the millennia. They participated in the Siege of Terra, laying waste to the Emperor's palace, and after the death of Horus, they continued their bloody spree in the Eastern Fringe. The havoc they wrought endured for Terran years long after the heresy had ended, cementing their legacy as an unrelenting force of terror and destruction, eternally cursed by the fate their Primarch had foreseen. Outwardly, the Night Lords entered the Horus heresy as a formidable force, one that had been hardened by countless battles and already harboured a festering grudge against the Loyalists. The imprisonment of Conrad Kurz on Cheraud, preceding the obliteration of Nostromo and the infamous confrontation with Rogel Dawn, only deepened the traitor's trust in the Night Haunter. Horus, fully aware of this, sought to leverage the Night Lords in his grand designs. Following the devastation of the Dropsite massacre, he positioned them at the vanguard of his plans to dismantle the Emperor's realm. The Night Lords were tasked with spearheading Horus's dark campaign, striking terror into worlds wavering in their loyalty to the Imperium. By the edge of their skinning knives, Horus would demonstrate the steep price of defiance, offering his protection only to those who bent the knee to his rebellion. As emissaries of Horus's dark compliance, the Night Lords spread fear across dozens of star systems, coercing them into the growing empire of the War Master. Within mere months, much of the Northern Imperium lay under traitor control, serving as a vital stronghold from which Horus could launch his final assault on Terra. However, as the Night Lords marauded through these newly conquered territories, they became more of a liability than an asset. For every minor production delay, every perceived slight or mishap, Kurz saw treachery and betrayal lurking in the shadows, meting out his only known punishment, death in the most horrific forms imaginable. This unchecked violence began to hinder the war effort, disrupting the supply lines of arms and munitions, more than it bolstered the loyalty of the subdued worlds. What had once been a legion that wielded cruelty as a tool of war had devolved into a mindless horde for whom cruelty itself was the end goal rather than a means to victory. No longer the sharp instrument the legions were meant to be, the Night Lords had become a rampaging scourge, instilling terror indiscriminately. Recognizing the potential threat they posed to his carefully orchestrated plans, Horus reassigned them to a new theatre of war. As they had done in the north, the Night Lords were now sent to the eastern fringe, tasked with bringing worlds into Horus's fold and securing resources for the growing traitor war machine. The Nostromo sector, which had once sworn allegiance to Kurz, would again face his brutal judgment. Though Nostromo itself had been destroyed, the sector's many hive worlds and star systems remained a valuable asset to the traitors, ripe for conquest and exploitation. The Nostromo sector, teeming with bitterness and lawlessness, was fertile ground for rebellion. Here, Horus saw an opportunity to harvest desperate souls to swell his ranks and supply his forces. It seemed a task well suited to the Night Lords, a grim error in judgment, as it would prove. The world surrounding Nostromo had long suffered under Kurz's harsh rule. His draconian laws had enforced a life of ceaseless toil and fear, with even the smallest infraction punished by death or maiming. Though this terror had maintained a brutal order, it had also eroded the spirit of those who lived under its shadow, festering into latent defiance. In Kurz's absence during the final years of the Great Crusade, many worlds within the sector had overthrown their tyrannical overlords, reverting to the anarchic ways of their past. Criminal syndicates and brutal gangs rose to power, indulging in the very debauchery Kurz had once forbidden. Though these new regimes could have served Horus's needs as well as any legitimate government to the Night Haunter, they were an intolerable blight. When the Night Lords arrived in the sector, the syndicates, such as the Blood Moon Syndarchs, sought to pledge their allegiance to Kurz, expecting that their tribute would secure his favour. Instead, they met only death. Kurz, driven by his dark vision of the future, descended upon Kedura IV and slaughtered the Syndarchs, leaving their world in ruins, indifferent to the resources or troops he might have gained through cooperation. Thus began Kurz's return to his home sector, one marked by indiscriminate purges and brutal punishments, even upon those worlds that had remained loyal to his rule. As other traitor legions fought over warp routes to Terra, the Night Lords waged their own private war, one driven not merely by conquest, but by Kurz's desperate attempt to deny the fate he had long foreseen. In the chaos and debauchery that had overtaken the Nostromo sector, Kurz saw the beginnings of his own destruction and the doom of his legion. It was a destiny he fought to avert, even as his methods grew increasingly reckless. He unleashed his legion to scour the sector of any trace of treachery, spilling blood in a futile effort to rewrite the course of fate. The Night Haunter's return to his former dominion was far more than a campaign of conquest for the War Master. It was the enactment of a grim vision, the next step on the path that had begun the moment Horus raised his banner in rebellion at Istvan III. For Kurz, each death, each act of violence, was another desperate strike against the inevitability of his doom, an attempt to escape the fate he had foreseen, his own death and the damnation of his legion. Had Conrad Kurz's instruments been sharper, his will more refined and unyielding, perhaps his desperate gambits might have borne fruit. But the Night Lords were no longer what they once had been. The rot within the Nostromo sector ran deeper and longer than most had imagined, its corruption spreading not just across the planets pledged to the Night Haunter, but into the very heart of his legion. For years, the Night Lords had drawn their recruits from a small cluster of worlds, primarily those orbiting Nostromo, and as those worlds decayed, so too did the quality of the warriors sent to the Legion. While these new recruits proved capable killers, they lacked the innate discipline and unwavering commitment that had marked the early Space Marine legions drawn from Terra. Many of the Night Lords' companies were now filled entirely with these raw recruits, much to the chagrin of veteran Terran warriors who had once carried the banner of the Great Crusade. These were the tools Kurz sought to wield in purging the infection festering in his crumbling dominion. Forged within the lawless and corrupt regimes that had overtaken Nostromo and its neighbouring worlds, these new Night Lords were vastly different from the hard-bitten warriors moulded by the brutal environment of old Nostromo. Where the Night Haunter had instilled a creed of justice, that every action must bear its consequences, and that blood spilled must be repaid in kind, the new breed of Night Lords had perverted these teachings. They believed only in power for its own sake, where the strong ruled over the weak with impunity, and justice in any form had long since withered away. This decay was evident among both the wealthy and the destitute. For the rich, power was measured by the wealth they wielded, purchasing and discarding lives as they saw fit. For the poor, power was the sharp edge of a blade, wielded with deadly efficiency. It was the most debased and cruel from this stratum of society that now filled the ranks of the Night Lords, warriors who believed that fear was the ultimate currency of strength. When unleashed by their Primarch, the true nature of these Night Lords was laid bare. No longer did they operate as a disciplined force, but as a marauding horde of warbands and raiders, each driven by its own bloodlust. They resembled neither the precise ranks of the 8th Legion in its prime, nor the focused brutality of the Raven Guard or White Scars. Instead, they acted as a chaotic mob of killers. Though their skill in battle was undeniable, and few could stand before their blade or bolter, they lacked the restraint and purpose that had once defined their legion. Few worlds escaped the terror of their onslaught. The Night Lords were meant to enforce order, but more often than not, they revelled in the grotesque spectacle of their raids. Fear, the weapon that their master had taught them to wield, became their obsession. They spread it like a disease, suffocating the world surrounding the ruins of Nostromo beneath a pall of terror. Yet, in their unrestrained brutality, they undermined the very purpose they had been sent to achieve. Those who survived were too broken to meet the tithes demanded by Horus. Among the Night Lords there remained a few who still clung to the old ways, fighting with the ruthless efficiency and pragmatism that had carried them through the Great Crusade. Yet their efforts to rebuild the fiefdom they had once ruled were constantly thwarted by the zealotry of the newer recruits. The Terran-born veterans and elder Nostroman warriors found themselves increasingly marginalized, their influence over the Night Haunter waning. His prophetic visions, dark and foreboding, drove him to ever greater acts of retribution, and the more vicious of his gene sons began to hold sway over him. Even as the veteran warriors' more measured and calculated methods brought greater rewards to the Legion, their efforts seemed inconsequential to Kurz. His mind, clouded by visions of a looming disaster, grew darker as Horus's rebellion spread, plunging the Imperium into widespread war and chaos. The Night Haunter began to listen less to the voices of experience, those who had fought at his side during the Great Crusade, and more to the urgings of his newer officers, those who embraced the bloodshed without question. The divide within the Legion deepened, with each group viewing the other as a threat to what they believed made the Night Lords strong. As the Night Lords' fleet gathered for the assault on the Thramas sector, as ordered by the War Master, the seeds of internal conflict were sown. Both factions, the veterans seeking to reclaim the old ways and the bloodthirsty recruits reveling in chaos, prepared for a campaign far different from the one Horus had envisioned. After the Dropsite massacre, Horus convened a council of the traitor Primarchs aboard his flagship, the Vengeful Spirit. 8 legions were called to this meeting, though Alfarius of the Alpha Legion was notably absent. 5 Primarchs attended in person, including Horus, Fulgrim, Angron, Mortarion and Lorgar. The others, Perturabo, Conrad Kurz and Magnus the Red, communicated through hololithic projectors, their signals transmitted via the warp. Magnus, recently fallen into the ranks of the traitors after the scouring of Prospero, had joined Horus's cause alongside the shattered remnants of his 15th Legion, now entrenched within the Eye of Terror on the planet of the Sorcerers. With their newfound hatred for the Emperor, the Thousand Sons became the 9th Traitor Legion. During the meeting, the Primarchs laid plans for the next phase of their war against the Emperor. Each legion was assigned its role, and soon after, they dispersed to execute their missions. The Night Lords had already set their course for Tsagualsa, a remote world in the eastern fringe hidden in the shadow of a vast asteroid belt. From there, Conrad Kurz would launch his terror campaign, targeting the imperial strongholds of Heroldar and Thramas. These systems, vital to securing the flanks of Horus's march on Terra, had to fall. More crucially, the campaign was designed to prevent the Dark Angels from reinforcing the Loyalists. For Horus knew that Lion L. Johnson would stop at nothing to halt the Night Lords' genocide in the Eastern Fringe. The Thramas system, home to several loyal Forge worlds of the Mechanicum, was key. While history would remember the Thramas Crusade as the battle between the Night Lords and the Dark Angels, it was also a battleground for the soul of Conrad Kurz himself. Amidst the grand battles and horrors of the traitors' assault on Thramas, the Night Lords were embroiled in their own internal rebellion. The Legion was torn between 2 opposing factions, those who longed for the glory days when they had stood among the legends of the Imperium, and those who sought only the freedom to pillage and kill as they pleased, without regard for higher purpose. Horus's rebellion had offered the Night Lords freedom, but in that freedom they found despair, both in the crumbling state of their Primarch and the degradation of their Legion. Those who embraced this newfound liberty were mostly recruits from the corrupted world surrounding Nostramo. These warriors formed a disorganized collection of warlords and warbands, united by little more than a desire for unchecked bloodshed. They sought to reshape the Legion in the image of Nostramo's ancient crime syndicates, caring nothing for the ideals of the Great Crusade or the broader goals of Horus. They adopted a cross of bone as their symbol, a mark derived from the traditions of the Nostraman sector that signified a conflict with only one possible outcome: death. For these warbands, the symbol represented their grim intent and their desire to fully exploit the dark gifts they had been granted. This faction aimed to carve out their own domain within Horus's new order, where they could rule as they saw fit, free from the constraints of the Night Haunter's often obscure visions. One of the most prominent figures among this group was Nakrid Thol, a ruthless warrior raised in the gang violence of Nostramo's hive cities. To Thol and his followers, Kurz was a distant, brooding figure, obsessed with prophecy and increasingly detached from the battlefield. If they could remove him from the front lines, they believed they could unleash the full fury of the Night Lords upon the galaxy, taking what had been denied to them during the Great Crusade. In opposition to this faction stood the veterans of the old 8th Legion, both Terran-born and the original Nostraman recruits. as well as newer warriors who still revered their Primarch. Though they too had joined Horus's rebellion, they clung to a code of honor, however harsh and unyielding. They believed in killing for a purpose, not for the sheer joy of slaughter. In their eyes, Kurz embodied this brutal sense of duty, a warrior willing to sacrifice appearances in service of a greater cause. Foremost among these veterans was Jago Sevatarian, who, though uninterested in Legion politics, became a symbol for those who sought to restore the Night Lords to their former glory. His red gauntlet, a death mark in Nostraman tradition, became the symbol of those loyal to Kurz. Sevatar fought tirelessly for his Primarch, committing atrocities not for his own satisfaction, but for the good of the Legion. However, he had little patience for the machinations of others, and fought his own battles without seeking allies among his peers. Other leaders emerged within this faction, such as Anrek Barbatos of Kurz's Honor Guard, whose dedication to the Night Haunter was unmatched. Together with other captains and praetors, they coordinated the internal war between the factions of the Night Lords, a conflict that would not be fought openly but in the shadows, through honor duels, assassinations, and political maneuvering. Commanders were struck down for the right to lead invasions, while others were disgraced in council or exiled from the Primarch's inner circle. As the Thramas Crusade intensified, so too did the struggle for control of the Legion. Nakrid Thol and his faction, bolstered by the death tolls of their campaigns, gained increasing influence over Kurz. Their violent triumphs drowned out the voices of the veterans, and the ranks of the Night Lords began to swell with recruits drawn to the promise of unchecked power and bloodshed. What remained of the disciplined 8th Legion that had once left Terra seemed to vanish beneath the chaos of this internal strife, leaving the Legion a shattered reflection of its former self. As Conrad Kurz's Legion vied for his attention, some seeking to save him, others to condemn him, the Night Haunter withdrew from his Gene Sons and descended into a fugue, only worsening the internal strife within the Night Lords. For years, Kurz had fought the dreadful future he glimpsed through the cursed fragment of his father's precognitive gift. In his youth, he had imposed order through the blood of the wicked, guided by the Emperor and his Primarch brothers. He had struggled to tame his foresight and see beyond the terrors it foretold. Even as he fought for Horus, he attempted to drown the visions in death, yet nothing worked. Whether through violence, order, or chaos, the nightmares remained unchanged, inescapable. The first signs of his prophecy had already come to pass. Corruption had overtaken his cities despite the rivers of blood shed to bind them in fear, and the Imperium had been plunged into civil war, just as he had tried to warn his brothers. To Kurz, the dark future he had foreseen seemed inevitable, 10,000 years of bloodshed and death stretching far beyond his own fate. After his failed attempts to alter this destiny in the Nostromo sector and the early stages of the Thramas Crusade, Kurz abandoned the battlefield and retreated to the unfinished Night Lord's fortress on Sagualsa. There, he imprisoned himself in a cage of despair, indulging in increasingly deranged and violent acts that disturbed even his legion. His time was spent wallowing in misery, raging at the futility of his struggle and torturing those unlucky enough to be brought to his lair. In Kurz's absence, Nakrid Thol and his followers, who bore the mark of the Cross of Bone, unleashed the Night Lords across the Thramas sector, prioritizing death tolls over strategic gains. As the Primarch sank deeper into his despondency, power shifted to Thol and his ilk, while those like Jago Sevatarian, loyal to their Primarch, remained tied to Kurz's side. They were left to wait, pleading with the Night Haunter to return to the battlefield. Their efforts bore fruit, though bitterly, when Kurz roused himself for a brief encounter with Lion L. Johnson on Sagualsa. In a strange and unhinged attempt to sway the Lion to Horus's cause, Kurz left a deep void beacon to lure one of the Dark Angel's scout ships. The beacon transmitted coordinates for a meeting on Sagualsa, where Kurz sought to confront his brother, either to break him physically, mentally, or both. Accompanied by their honor guards, the Primarchs met with a veneer of civility. However, the fragile peace shattered when Kurz insulted L. Johnson, prompting the Lion to strike him. What followed was an all-out brawl. As the Night Haunter strangled El Johnson, a Dark Angel honor guard stabbed Kurz in the back, saving his Primarch's life. Reinforcements soon arrived from both legions, and the battle ended with each side dragging their respective Primarchs away. No one knows what Kurz truly hoped to achieve from that fight. Perhaps he had hoped to find answers in sharing his visions, or maybe he wished to warn the Lion of the horrors to come. Perhaps he even sought death, believing it the only escape from his tortured fate. Whatever his intentions, Kurz left the battlefield bloodied and no more sane than when he had arrived. This pattern repeated itself at Sheol, where Kurz once again threw himself at the Lion, forcing his Gene Sons to sacrifice themselves to recover his broken body. Even in his near-comatose state, Kurz remained central to the Legion's turmoil. Those who sought to liberate the Legion from his grip blamed him for their dire situation, while those who sought to restore both Kurz and the Legion to their former glory fought to preserve him despite his failures. Ironically, it was Kurz's own actions that tipped the balance in favor of those loyal to him. By granting the more reckless members of his Legion too much freedom, Kurz allowed them to overextend themselves, leading to a series of defeats in the Thramas Crusade. They fell victim to their own hubris. In the final months of the Thramas campaign, the tide turned. Many of those who followed the Cross of Bone met their end. Nacrid Thol perished at Thramas, Vaiduk the Maimed fell at Sheol, and Melithos and Kelheric were killed by Jago Sevatarian and his Atramenta. With their deaths, the more loyal sons of Kurz regained control of the Legion. Sevatar assembled a new inner council, the Chiroptera, composed of warriors loyal to the Legion's survival. Under their leadership, the Legion charted a more pragmatic course, abandoning the chaos and excess that had dominated the majority of the Thramas campaign. Determined to restore the Legion to its former strength, the Chiroptera ordered the Night Lords to rejoin Horus's forces. They would fight as warriors once more, casting aside the shadows in which they had hidden. Thramas and the madness it had inflicted on their Primarch were left behind. The Night Lord's fleet, battered and scarred, departed the eastern fringe, returning to the heart of the war in the Segmentum Solar. Free from the burden of Nostramo and the weight of their homeworld's destruction, they would fight as conquerors, not wardens. This was Sevatar's plan, to liberate the Legion from its slow decline and return it to glory alongside their wounded, yet still potent, Primarch. It was not to be. Just as the warships of the Night Lords converged, their commanders swayed by Sevatar's arguments or cowed by the blades of his allies, the two nemeses that had shadowed them in the Thramas sector once more intervened. The first was the Dark Angels, the very embodiment of the Emperor's wrath, a force of righteous destruction that could not be matched in a direct contest. Their black fleet emerged from the warp, and the fury of their guns was the retribution for the Night Lord's hubris and countless sins, cutting through the remnants of the Night Haunter's fleet like a scythe. Yet, even this was not enough to crush the Night Lords entirely. The Lion and his sons could wound them deeply, but not deliver the final blow before they escaped to seek the path back to glory. It was the second nemesis, far deadlier and inescapable, that sealed their fate. As the Night Lord's vessels neared the preset warp point that would have carried them to Horus's side, the Night Haunter suddenly awoke from his torpor and commanded his Legion to engage the Dark Angels. Unable to disobey their Gene Father and unwilling to abandon him to the Loyalists' mercy, many of the Night Lords turned to launch a final suicidal assault. Perhaps this was Kurz's last desperate bid to die at the hands of his brother, evading the dark fate he had foreseen, or maybe it was one final spiteful strike against his enemies. Whatever the reason, the attack was doomed from the start. It could neither halt nor delay the Dark Angels, but it shattered the fragile remains of the Night Lords as a cohesive force. Those Astartes who managed to break free from the battle were scattered across the galaxy, vanishing into the warp, while those who turned back to fight for their cursed master were almost entirely obliterated. All the bloodshed to restore the Night Lords, all the suffering they had endured, had been rendered meaningless, undone by the very actions of Conrad Kurz. The Legion, now fragmented, became a poison scattered across the Imperium. sowing chaos and death wherever its disparate warbands roamed. It was the very nightmare Kurz had envisioned brought to life, an endless spiral of destruction and damnation, just one step removed from the oblivion that awaited them, and from the Night Haunter's own death by his father's decree, a future he had so long dreaded. The last bitter sting for Kurz, the final howl of despair that haunted him as he was taken aboard the Dark Angel's flagship, Invincible Reason in Chains, was the knowledge that he himself had brought the curse to fruition. Here, the story of Konrad Kurz would come to an end. The troubled son of the Emperor was subsumed by the darkness that had claimed him long ago, leaving only the Night Haunter and the cold embrace of death. By the end of 010 year of the 31st millennium, the fires of war raged in the remote Sota system. The battered fleets of the Night Lords, fresh from the murderous Thramas crusade, smashed through the orbital defences of the Ultramarines and seized control of this forgotten corner of Ultramar. This act drew the wrath of the 500 worlds, whose fleets vastly outnumbered the Night Lords, making the assault seem ill-advised if the goal was merely a frontier world. But Sota concealed something far more valuable than resources or manpower: the Pharaohs, a mysterious device key to the Ultramarines' defense. Capturing this relic would not only grant the Night Lords the favor of War Master Horus, but also cement their place within his dark empire. Among the Night Lords' warlords, one was chosen to lead the assault on Sotha, Clawmaster Zar Siakar. A warrior whose ambition far outstripped his caution, Siakar boasted of the victory his forces would achieve, blind to the contempt of his peers. With the Night Haunter missing since the end of the Thramas crusade, Siakar saw this as his opportunity to rise to power within the leaderless legion. His fellow captains, grim veterans of the 8th Legion, granted him this chance, offering their support, and even warriors from the elite Atramentar to assist his assault. Eager for glory, Siakar accepted without hesitation, pushing his ships to the vanguard of the fleet. The assault on Sota began with a barrage of macro-cannon fire and incendiary shells, indiscriminately destroying habitation zones and igniting a firestorm that consumed the city of Sothopolis. Drop pods and assault craft followed in their wake, carrying 7 companies of Night Lords, with Siakar and the Atramentar at the forefront. Sota's anti-air defences answered with volleys of missiles and laser fire, turning the sky into a blazing storm, but the majority of the Night Lord's forces landed unscathed on the outskirts of the city. Within hours, the Night Lords were tearing through the burning streets, overwhelming the Ultramarines' Egida Company as they fought in vain to defend the city and its terrified inhabitants. As black smoke choked the horizon and the Night Lords rampaged through Sothopolis, their victory seemed all but assured. Yet, even in their triumph, the shadow of Konrad Kurz loomed over them. Clawmaster Zar Siakar commanded the assault from the safety of his Spartan assault tank, orchestrating the devastation as his warriors flooded the streets of Sothopolis. Surrounding him was a cadre of elite Atramentar Terminators, brutal killers from Sevatarian's now fragmented First Company, scattered across the warbands of the 8th Legion to enforce the will of the Night Lord's warlords. The armoured spearhead surged forward, a column of Land Raider Proteus transports and Demos pattern rhinos packed with assault troops, supported by the swift Saber-Strike tanks and heavily armed Sikaran Punishers. Siakar's coded Vox signal resonated across all Night Lord's frequencies, prompting the vehicle column to lurch forward. They advanced with deadly purpose toward the 13th Legion Castellum, guarding the approaches to the mountain where the Pharos was concealed. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre, with the Night Lords venting their pent-up rage from the Thramas defeat on the hapless defenders of Sotha. Proteus, Patternland, Speeders and Legion Outrider squadrons swept ahead of the main force, herding the terrified civilian populace into the waiting blades of the 8th Legion. The city echoed with the revving of chain blades, the thunder of bolters, and the agonized screams of the Sothans, creating a cacophony of terror that reverberated throughout the doomed city. The Ultramarines fought a desperate retreat, sacrificing themselves to slow the invaders and give time for civilians to escape the carnage. Yet the overwhelming force of the Night Lords began to take its toll. The defenders rigged entire sections of buildings to collapse across the advancing column, crushing legionaries beneath tons of rubble and blocking the path of armoured vehicles. Still, the Night Lords pressed on, Siakar and his Atramentar at the spearhead, grinding all resistance beneath the relentless treads of their Spartan tank. Night Raptors swooped ahead of the formation, using controlled bursts from their jump packs to leap over wreckage and fall upon the Ultramarines like predators, tearing them apart with jagged swords and vicious axes. One by one, pockets of resistance were encircled and eradicated, the wounded dragged away to face unspeakable fates in the Night Lords' torture pits. The last remnants of the Ultramarines' garrison made their stand at Attican Square, a strategic choke point where the roads leading to the Castellum converged. Centurion Viron Ekar, the final officer of the 13th Legion still standing, rallied the surviving forces amidst the chaos, forming a phalanx of breachers and suzerain bodyguards in front of a marble statue of Robuta Gilliman. Under the watchful gaze of their Primarch's effigy, they prepared to hold their ground at all costs. 2 Deredeo-patterned dreadnoughts, Ancients Menario and Argon, took up positions flanking the monument, their Anvilus autocannon batteries trained skyward, while Predator and Sicaran tanks blocked the remaining routes to the Castellum. But the Night Lords responded with their characteristic cruelty. Hundreds of civilians, eyes sewn shut or gouged out, were driven into the square as human shields, stumbling blindly toward the Ultramarines' lines. Behind them came squadrons of Night Lords' land raiders and rhinos, their hulls adorned with the flayed bodies of captured ultramarine neophytes, twisted parodies of the Emperor's Aquila. For a crucial moment, the 13th Legion's forces hesitated, stunned by the Night Lords' barbarism. In that instant, several enemy vehicles were destroyed in a torrent of explosive rounds and plasma fire, but the majority broke through, leaving a trail of crushed bodies in their wake. As the vehicles ground to a halt before the Ultramarines' position, assault ramps dropped with a deafening crash, disgorging despoiler and terror squads of the 8th Legion, who charged the cobalt-blue shield wall with murderous zeal. Viron Ekar stood among the front rank of his warriors, his gold and blue suzerain bodyguards forming an unbreakable wall of shields around him. The Order Singite Frontum rang out, and the disciplined Ultramarines raised their shields higher, bracing for the incoming assault. The Night Lords struck with chain blades and bolt pistols, searching for any gap in the shield wall. But they were met with an impenetrable defence. As one, the Ultramarines slammed their boarding shields into their foes, sending many Night Lords sprawling. The shield wall briefly parted, and the suzerains struck, cutting down the nearest attackers with precise blows from their power axes before closing ranks once more. The Night Lords' charge faltered, some forced into defence, while others pressed forward with reckless abandon. The clash became a vicious melee, with the Ultramarines fighting with the cold, methodical discipline their legion was famed for. They blocked and thrust with their gladii, killing or crippling their opponents with every strike. The Night Lords fought like savage brawlers, using the bodies of their dead as stepping stones to leap over the shield wall and drag their foes down, hacking at vulnerable joints and firing bolt pistols into the eye lenses of their enemies' helmets. Overhead, Xiphon interceptors and fire raptors in the midnight blue of the 8th Legion strafed the Ultramarines' rear positions with deadly precision, unleashing streams of Avenger bolt cannon shells and las cannon blasts. They paid a steep price for their audacity as the Castellum's anti-air batteries opened fire, tearing many of the attackers from the sky. Predator tanks were reduced to flaming wrecks, and the Ultramarines' lines were decimated. But the Deredeo Ancients brought down several of the enemy aircraft, sending them crashing into the ruined buildings of Scythopolis. As the battle raged on, the ground was littered with the dead of both legions. The Ultramarines' shield wall, once a formidable bulwark, had shrunk to a mere fraction of its former size. The statue of Gilliman, now scarred by gunfire and stained with blood, stood as a silent witness to the carnage. Injured Ultramarines were pulled behind the line by apothecaries, firing over the shoulders of their brothers as they fought to hold the Night Lords at bay. Time seemed to stretch as both legions, locked in bitter combat, refused to yield an inch, each side determined to break the other or die trying. As the battle wore on and the stalemate at Attican Square deepened, a Spartan assault tank, silent until now, roared to life amidst the Night Lord's armoured vehicles. Slowly at first, the massive war machine gained momentum, advancing toward the desperate clash at the square's edge. Clawmaster Tsar Siakar, sensing that the Loyalists had been weakened by waves of expendable troops, decided it was time to seize his victory. Flanked by his grim Atramenta guard, Siakar prepared to join the fray and claim the glory for himself. The Spartans smashed into the throng of Ultramarines and Night Lords, crushing all beneath its relentless tracks, indifferent to whether the blood it spilled belonged to friend or foe. With the Ultramarines' shield wall fractured, the Night Lords swarmed through the breach, overwhelming their enemies. The Spartans' hatches flung open, and Siakar, accompanied by his Atramentar, stormed into the melee. Clad in midnight blue Tartaros Terminator armor, adorned with grotesque trophies torn from the dead, the Atramentar carved a bloody path through Ultramarines and fellow Night Lords alike, their Nostroman Changleves slashing indiscriminately. Centurion Viron Ekar, resplendent in his intricately crafted artificer armor, became the target of two Atramentar warriors, their murderous intent evident as they sought to claim his life as the final blow that would decide the battle. Ekar, battered but unyielding, struggled to hold his ground against the Terminator's savage assault. His remaining suzerain guards rushed to their commander's aid, but one of the Atramentar callously hurled a Night Lord into their path, using the hapless warrior as a shield. The brief distraction was enough. One suzerain fell to a point-blank plasma blaster shot, and the rest were intercepted by the Terminator's whirling Changlev. Ekar, locked in combat with the other Atramentar, was unaware of Siakar's approach until it was too late. With a sudden, brutal strike, the Clawmaster drove the crackling talons of his lightning claw through the Ultramarine officer's chest, rending both of his hearts. In one swift motion, Siakar tore the Centurion's head from his shoulders, the teeth of his Changlev gnashing through bone and helm alike. The fall of Viron Ekar signalled the collapse of the Ultramarine defence. Their formation shattered, the surviving Loyalists were cut down where they stood. The bodies of the fallen littered the square, their broken shields and mangled armour a silent testament to their last stand. Siakar, poised on the edge of triumph, stood victorious amidst the carnage. His triumph, however, would be short-lived. As the Clawmaster knelt to carve his mark into Ekar's bloodied corpse, the Atramentar, assigned to him by the unseen hand of his rivals, closed in. Their weapons primed and ready, the elite Terminators followed the orders they had received from orbit to eliminate the overreaching Clawmaster who had dared to challenge the order of things. Siakar had forgotten the lessons Conrad Kurz had instilled in his sons, that glory and honour were fleeting, that victory was hollow. Only the will to wield the blade mattered, and the strength to determine where it would fall.